And we are live. Hello, listeners, viewers in this case.
Yeah.
Today I am with Dr. Wolfheze, who is, of course, a regular guest on these shows, and a new guest, Mr. Steuckers, who to an international audience probably won't be as well known, but he is very well known in the Dutch and Flemish scene and the French scene particularly. And in the sort of the context of introducing the ideas from the past and the personalities from the past, the garde vieux sort of idea, to a lot of the newer people in this movement, particularly the people who follow my channel generally are quite new to this movement, quite new to the ideas, and they won't know particularly European ideas because, of course, Anglo-Saxon ideas, American and English content is very predominant in the online scene. And Mr. Steuckers has been active within Nouvelle Droite particularly. So to first hand off the word to Dr. Steuckers, how about you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing over the last 40 years, has it been?
Yeah, exactly it's exactly 40 years ago, indeed. So first of all, hello everyone. But 40 years ago, I was working in Paris for the redaction of the main journal of the Nouvelle Droite, which was Nouvelle, which is still Nouvelle, but I don't know anything of the organization of this magazine, of this journal today. The remembrance of all this has been written only in English, so it will be easy for them who wants more details to read long text that I give for Russian France about the Nouvelle Droite and my own position, my own biography. In a certain way, it's written in English. It's the longest text I ever wrote in English. So 40 years ago, I was working for the redaction of Nouvelle. I was in the same offices as Mr. de Benoit on one side and Mr. Fay on the other side. So we worked together for about 1 year. Then after that, I had to go to the army for my military service for 1 year, about 1 year. Then I got married, and I had other occupations, and I worked together with them till, of course, when Fay abandoned the ship in 87, but I worked till 92. I tried to find a solution.
Nouvelle, you mean?
Yeah, and Nouvelle and the rest, and the Allemand and all the magazines and the publication they had at that time, and they still have. So I started in 92, and in 92 I decided to abandon the ship myself for several reasons that you can read in English too, in the booklet that has been issued by Actos about Guillaume Fay after his death in March 2019. And then we started with other people. We started the movement Synergie Européenne, or Synagogue in German. And of course, it lasted till 2002. Then we had, of course, in 2002, and after that, I had many personal problems. The main problem was my mother, who was over 90 at that time, and I had to take care of her, which was a very difficult job. And I started again in 2007. I started the website Euro Synergies, which was mainly in 7 languages at the start. So the 6 languages of the Royal Belgian Academy, plus Portuguese. And now we have published almost 18,000 articles on this site that you can check, that you can consult at every time, and it's updated every day with at least 4 articles or videos that are taken over from all possible other sites, but we have also now, of course, a very well drilled redactional team. So that's since 2007. And we started this year because I was retired and I had more time. So we started a second website in German and Dutch.
Yeah, the link is in the description to that, by the way, for any Dutch language listeners.
But of course, it's a very long story, and there are a lot of details. I don't want to annoy our listeners by details, so I would prefer. So my in the 40 years, so it was 11 years cooperation with the Nouvelle Droite in Paris, with the French mainly. But in '83, we decided at least to give a full independence on the not the Belgian, but the Brussels-based team. We decided to give an independence by creating our own journals, which were Vouloir and Orientation, etc. Then between 93 and 2002, 2003, it was the period of Synergie Européenne and Senegal. Then after that, I had a break of 3 years about to care because my mother was ill, and she was very old. She has never been ill, but she was very old. And then from 2007 till now, it's the website with several activities around it, where I was mainly a speaker for different groups in Belgium, in Germany, and in France, mainly.
Yeah.
In the 80s, I was several times in England for the initiatives of Michael Walker. And so you can divide the periods, these 40 years, in 3 periods.
Well, to sort of summarize, you were at the birth of the Nouvelle Droite, together with Faye and de Benoist then, and you've always had a very sort of pan-European, more international perspective on things, which since you're Flemish is relatively unique, because of course the Flemish movement is very particularist and to a fault usually Francophobic, whereas you actually work together with the French quite a lot.
No, the problem is my own life. You know, after the Second World War, and especially in the suburbs in the south of Brussels, there were no real Dutch-speaking schools. So I was compelled to go to a French-speaking school. So my education was in French, like many people in Brussels. Now the situation changed in the 90s, where people started to send again their children to Dutch-speaking schools because of immigration. Let us say frankly, it's because of immigration, where the immigrants speak, of course, mainly French because they come from former French colonies. And so there was a shift in the population, which is, let's say, a challenge that the Flemish movement is not conscious of. It's to say that the French, having in their family, when they are French speaking, they are educated in Dutch, which is a completely different shift in the view the Flemish movement has on the situation in Brussels and in Belgium in general. Because if you live in Antwerp or in Ghent, this is not a problem that you have to cope with.
Well, you see? Say that in Brussels, the Flemish movement doesn't really have much foot on the ground, really.
No, but there were people, but the problem is that when people having a Flemish background, and I remember that very well in my own part of the city, we were, let's say, 30 years ago, we were 5-6 people buying the satirical weekly paper of Antwerp, Politieke. So we were 5-6 people, but I'm the only one in my part of the city reading Politieke. So that's quite sad. But I remember a man who was an officer of I don't remember which ministry. He was buying Politieke, and we had a conversation every Wednesday when the journal was out, and we had a conversation. He said, "Now I'm a pensionist. I go back to live in my village where I come from." So he disappeared, and maybe this man is now surely dead because he was quite old. And you see, that's the situation. They all disappear. Flemish-speaking people are not replaced, and they are replaced either by immigrants, by refugees, or by official of the European Union. Which is the main problem of Brussels, because you have two bulk population that are not paying taxes. The immigrants, because they are poor, or the refugees, because they are poor, they have no revenues, or the expats from the European Union, who, of course, they don't pay taxes in Belgium.
No. Well, Brussels is very much an international city, and you can really tell the old glory of the city is very dilapidated with poorly maintained roads and buildings and immigrants everywhere. Yes, but what I sort of wanted to get at is that your perspective has always been more international than most of the Flemish movement has been. The Flemish movement is particularist, sort of focused only on local issues, whereas with Euro Synergies particularly is very focused on international issues, and you work together with many intellectuals from many countries. You work with Archeofuturism now, I believe, and in the past, of course, with you were talking about in Hamburg. You were situated.
No, but first of all, because we were, let's say, European, this European level of Euro Synergie, it depends also on the past, because the most important figure, I would say a non-conformist. I wouldn't say he was on the right or he was on the left. It was Jean Thiriart. Jean Thiriart was, of course, a European militant, I would say, for a strong Europe, independent from the United States and from the Soviet Union at the time of the Cold War. But Thiriart was quite a rough man. I liked him very much. He was maybe very difficult to talk with him because he was mostly rejecting. He was very pessimistic about about mankind. But it took more than 10 years to tame him in a certain way. But at the end, the last weeks of his life, unfortunately, he died in November 92. But in August, July, August, he was a neighbor. I must say, he lived here around the corner. And he admitted that I was, in a certain way, right to open the movement, not on pure political, although we are political, thoroughly political, but we publish also, of course, about literature, tradition, practical things that at the very beginning of our relation, he said, you are literate and you're not political, and he was angry, and we had sometimes every day a very he was sending insulting letters, but I never could be, let's say, upset by that, and I answered with irony. And I said, yeah, but there, you're right, but you shouldn't express that like that. Otherwise, your movement has been, has crumbled down due to your attitude.
So insulting was already a problem back then.
Yeah, no, but so Thierry was a European, and he had very good collaborators in the 60s, and one of these collaborators, Bernard Garcet, he was the man who, when we were young students, he could teach us what we had to do, what we had to read, how we had to express ourselves, etc. And it was this Bernard Garcet who was a teacher at that time, who taught us how to organize a metapolitical movement. And he was European. His wife was an Hungarian, and I must thank this lady, even after more than 40 years. I have to thank her because she had the patience to accept young students in her home who were sometimes asking silly questions, of course. She accepted marvelously, and I thank her really today after almost 50 years.
But what I mean is, the perspective has always been more pan-European, and that's let's say that it is one of the things that I try to promote as well, because there is sort of a middle way where people call it petty nationalism, where they say like the old nationalism is dead, can't work anymore in the modern world. It's all too globalized. Yet at the same time, if you go too much towards globalism, of course, you will simply destroy everything you're trying to protect. So one thing I find interesting about Euro Synergies and the ideas of the Nouvelle Droite is this sort of pan-European, but with particularism sort of idea, where we work together as a Europe, but we do not try to destroy our traditions. That's where you get your futurist school and so on from as well.
Yeah, of course, a second aspect of my option, my European option, was the fact that I come from the translator school. So we had a very important part of our training was in international affairs. So I belonged to the German group, the students learning the German language, and therefore we had to study thoroughly the history of Germany, and it was a very well done course. The lectures were very interesting, and so we had a perspective on Germany, but on Austria too, of France, of course, because the teacher was a Gaullist. She was a Gaullist lady. Then I had France, and my first wife, she studied Spanish, so we had an opening to Spain and Latin America, and etc., etc. So we couldn't be anything else than open to the world.
Would you say that sort of succeeded, that these ideas are now more widespread and that there's more cooperation between nationalists? What sort of ideals that you were trying to promote back in the day? The cooperation is
not due to us. The cooperation that exists now is simply due to the fact that all European people, all European countries face the same problems. So if you see, of course, then in the European Parliament there is the cooperation with up and downs, of course, cooperation between the several countries, which is compulsory in the system of the European Union. You have to go and look for cooperation beyond the national borders. But this cooperation opened the eyes of a lot of people, so they have to recruit bilingual or trilingual people to be able to coordinate the teams in the European Parliament.
Yeah.
So
what
that's
I mean simply is like not so much in the context of the established politics, but so the Meletta political movement, the dissident movement, sort of outside of parliament, cultural activism, the sort of thing we generally tend to do here, all three of us. I think a lot of the ideas of the Nouvelle Droite have permeated sort of the zeitgeist of that sort of movement. And I agree with you that the international cooperation did not take many of the ideas from that movement into it as a sort of ideological foundation. It's more of alliances of convenience most of the time. For example, with the populist movements who support Brexit and exit simply because of a sort of onderbuikgevoel against the European Union but it has no solid ideological foundations. What I kind of wanted to get is like, what do you think we did take away from the Nouvelle Droite, from your work, from the work of Faye and Venner and so on? And what did we neglect to take away from it and that we could still usefully employ?
We can, of course, I would say Venner. It's not very well known outside France. Venner was very important as a political, national revolutionist activist in the 60s. But at the end of the 60s, in France, there was a shift, a completely different, the beginning of the 60s in France is completely different as the middle of the 60s and completely different from the end of the 60s. At the beginning, you had France plus Algeria.
Algeria.
Okay, then in 62, Algeria becomes an independent state with 1 million French leaving Algeria to settle in the mother country. Then at the middle, de Gaulle tries to emancipate from the United States. But he creates, with other people, I must say, economists, engineers, etc., he tried to create the conditions of an independent country living in autarky for energy, for military things, etc., which could be a model. You had in Germany a Gaullist movement saying, why we German, at the end of the breakthrough that was the economical miracle in Germany, why don't we try to get independent as the French do? Yeah. So that was but the CIA created in Germany and in France the 68 movement, which destroyed the projects
the Soviet
of
Union.
Independence, of national or European independence.
It has to be said that although de Gaulle and Gaullism were seen as the enemy of nationalism by a lot of French nationalists in the 60s, we can take a lot of lessons indeed from de Gaulle, because one thing, he was very much an Americaphobe and he didn't want to be part of the Atlanticist sort of project. And in a previous stream, Mr. Wolfheze and I discussed some of the ideas of Dugin about and the world island. And you could see de Gaulle, in a sense, employing sort of ideas in that sense, not in the sense that they wanted to take over the world island, but in the sense that he opposed Atlanticism and tried to build a continental power. Yes, we should take lessons from that, I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, and lessons from, but that's a bit too fastidious to discuss here. A lesson from the intellectuals who helped this movement to concretize. I think I will quote only one name here, which is François Perroux. François Perroux created the idea of continental autarky, but he worked for Latin America. He's very well known in Latin America. In France, he wrote the book L'Indépendance Nationale, so national independence, which is the core, asking, for example, for an energetical independence, which is still a problem today for Europe.
Yeah,
and then, of course, this was only one person. Then the system, the social system, had to be in between the communist system and the hyper-capitalist system of the United States. So they tried to create what they called participation. So the workers were supposed to participate, and they received more salary if the enterprise, the company in which they were working, was making benefits. So this was a system which was quite interesting, and therefore the left, the extreme left, was mobilized against de Gaulle, because this was an answer ruining the Marxist project, which is also quite interesting to observe. But that's only a part of your question. Your question is, on the other level, you see, it's interesting to see also the Second World War had created a sort of convergency of literary feelings throughout Europe. The Germans organized in 42 or 43, I don't remember, a European Congress of writers and poets, etc. The French came, Knut Hamsun came, Italian writers came, Danish, all kind of people, and they were trying to read each other. After the Second World War, the English and the Americans tried to introduce their own literature in the main course. And I just read yesterday, because I had a walk in my part of the city, where there is a second-hand bookshop, and I discovered from Pierre Stephanie, which is maybe the most important writer. He's a journalist. He wrote dozens of volumes about the everyday life in Belgium, let's say from the beginning of the 20th century till now. And I got the copy of the years between 44 and 51. Is to say the regency of Prince Charles of Belgium, who replaced his brother, King Leopold III, who was first prisoner in Germany, and then the British and the Americans prevented him to come back to Belgium, and he was in exile in Switzerland. So this period where the repression against pro-German movements was very harsh, but he describes also the shift in literature. So there was the discovering of English literature, but an English literature which was an English and American literature, which was very interesting in the way that people like Steinbeck, for instance, were people having experimented all kind of experiences in everyday life, which was not the case of, for instance, especially for French-speaking Belgium, which was not the case from the main intellectuals, French intellectuals, who were purely intellectual. So they discovered, but the French decided also, especially the right, they said, yeah, but they were really, they had contact with reality, and there was a shift. Both, let's say, intellectual or philosophical policies of the Germans and of the English and Americans in Europe brought a generalization of literature throughout Europe. So you could be French and read Knut Hamsun, or Italian and read a Scandinavian author, and vice versa. A Norwegian could discover, for instance, many important Italian or Spanish writers. And in Spain remained neutral during the Second World War, but Ortega y Gasset was, let's say, a partisan to mix German and Spanish thinking. And he said it could be a very interesting mixture, or a new culture, mixing, I wouldn't say Latin, because I wouldn't define Spain as purely Latin. It's Iberian, it's different. But you see, there were several in our countries. Of course, it's perhaps an exception, because the Low Countries are, and that's our exception, and that's what I want to stress here. An intellectual in the 20th century, from the 19th century on, let's say from the crumbling down of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands in 1830 till now, all the intellectuals of a certain level, they are automatically they speak or understand 4 languages: French, English, German, and Dutch. And Scandinavian languages, it's not a very high problem for us. Then, of course, they had at that time, and that's the decadence, the decline, the decline of Europe, is the decline of the teaching of so-called dead languages, Latin and Greek. They all had studied Latin, but not exactly like in France. Here, we were perhaps the last little boys of 11, 12, 13 years old that had Latin in a very systematic way, giving us the opportunity to compare languages. And of course, I discovered when I was 13, in my grandfather was not illiterate. He couldn't understand no Italian, but there was in his basket next to his chair an Italian magazine. And I could see that I could understand at least half the text, only with the courses of Latin.
Yeah.
So even for a French-speaking Belgian or a Dutchman having had Latin at school, he could read Italian and Spanish and Portuguese, no problem.
But I would say that we have, the Dutch haven't had many intellectuals or intellectual schools. Like, I can name a few Calvinist intellectuals like Groen van Prinsteren and Abraham Kuyper, but there's not much, I would say.
No, but you have Huizinga and the problem. Look, I will simply give you an example because I've got it here. Sorry, I will give you here one example of book. It's this one. Mm-hmm. It's a course of the Catholic University of Louvain. It's almost 900 pages, but this is the best introduction in the world about geopolitics. Why? Because the quotation and the bibliography are in 6 languages.
Uh-huh. But okay. That's what I mean. We are eminently practical. the
Yeah.
Dutch. We
Yeah.
are very good at the middle level of academic work, translating, explanations, STEM fields, physics, engineering, but we have no great philosophical schools like the French or the Germans have, I would say. No great philosophy of our own.
Yeah, but on the other hand, these system or this kind of ersatz, it's a kind of ersatz of churches in France and Germany. Yes, at the end, it's quite boring, you know. To see the repetition, always the repetition of the same patterns, the same intellectual patterns.
Once you're familiar with it, I suppose so. Yes, but
I mean, yeah, in France, in Paris, it was very boring. And for instance, they say, why don't you go and why don't you participate to a congress or to a conference or to a meeting in Paris? No, I'm fed up. I would leave the room after 1 hour to
but you have been exposed
have
to these
a good pint on the pub next door.
Yeah, but again, you've been exposed to these ideas for 40 years. For many people, it's completely new, and they are not familiar with these ideas. And it's sort of the privilege of the older and more educated person to be bored of new ideas.
They are not new. I mean, they are not new. It's a repetition of what I have heard in the 80s. The problem is, look, the geopolitical, because that's also an heritage of Thierry. He was very interested in geopolitics. That's an heritage of the courses I had at university about international affairs. The geopolitical situation has thoroughly changed since the 80s. First of all, the perestroika of Gorbachev has changed completely the perspective. Then the situation in the Balkans, where Europe was unable to find a solution of its own for our own continent, on our own soil, was impossible to find. Now, the development of the Turkish neo-Ottoman perspective, the troubles in the Caucasus, now the troubles in Burma or Myanmar, they are very important. They change the perspective. We have tried now since a couple of months, as well as in French or in Dutch. In Italy, there is no problem. There are several schools, several very interesting sites that we translate to cope with all those problems in a very pragmatical and rational way. But if you see the Nouvelle Droite in France, except it's outside the Nouvelle Droite, that you have schools in France like the l'École de Guerre Économique, so the economical warfare school, or the magazine Conflit, or official publication of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There you find stuff to develop geopolitics of our own. Not in the groups of the Nouvelle Droite. It's finished. It's finished, and Faye, who had a struggle, a long 20-year struggle before he died with the group, he analyzes the situation very well in several books, Archeofuturism, which is translated into English, or the last one, the Global Coup, which is the last book of Faye that Arctos has published some weeks ago, I think. The English-speaking people can read Faye about what I say. It's not my own opinion. It's an opinion that was generalized.
But are you saying then that Archeofuturism is not part of the Nouvelle Droite?
No, it could be a part of the Nouvelle Droite, of course, but one thing is sure, is to say Archeofuturism, what was it? There is a discussion, but outside the Nouvelle Droite with new people, a certain Marius John, they have always another perspective, or Mr. Dapremont. There are several people trying to redefine after Fay's death the concept of Archeofuturism. In the book of Fay himself, there was a little novel at the end. One day of Oblomov, of Commissar Oblomov, one day in the life of Commissar Oblomov. Oblomov is a Russian. He lives in Kamchatka in the far east of Siberia. And he has to solve a problem in Brittany. And there you have, in a very funny way, it has been translated into a book in German. The Germans were right to publish that like that. Not the whole book on Archeofuturism, but only the novel. And the novel explains that Fay, in fact, is not maybe a futurist in a total way. There is a futurist, but futurism, technology, high technology, artificial intelligence, biotechnology is for the elite. But the common people, they should live traditionally, archaically.
But that is sort of where
that there are two levels, and that he accepts both.
Yeah. That's sort of where Archeofuturism crosses along with cyberpunk, and you get ideas from the neo-reactionary movement from like Big Land, where AI gets introduced. I'd say Archeofuturism has spread really far and wide of all the ideas of the Nouvelle Droite, especially it's been taken up by Americans particularly. I would like to give the word to Mr. Wolfheze, who hasn't said anything for 40 minutes now, if he has anything to add here.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me back on. It is a pleasure and an honor to speak with Mr. Steuckers. I would like to remind our international audience, so the people that are not from our Benelux countries, that Mr. Steuckers is quite a central figure in the European New Right. It is very worthwhile for them to investigate his writings and the things that he posts and translates on Synergy and Euro Synergies. That they will find many languages there. So I do recommend that once again. Please look at it. Another thing that comes to mind when I hear him speak is that it's necessary to remind our younger viewers, most of the people that watch the show will be younger, that there is a continuity of our new right movement and the identitarian movement even, with the alt-right movement that existed in the 40s and the Nouvelle Droite across a very large gap. And that gap is the globalist gap, the time that we were being globalized by the internet and by the Anglosphere. That our continent was overrun by American ideas and the English language. And across the gap also between the time of books, the book world that you see behind Mr. Steuckers, and the digital world in which we are living now. These gaps are very substantial, but there still exists a continuity. And Mr. Steuckers is the living representation of this continuity. It's an important thing for young people to understand that the ideas that are living in a new right and the Nouvelle Droite as it still exists today, they are coming from a very far past, a very deep past, that the European tradition is something that requires a long breath, that needs investigation, that also needs skills that are almost gone now. This means the command of many languages, as Mr. Steuckers has pointed out, the command of ancient languages, Greek and Latin, as Mr. Steuckers has pointed out. And also another thing, the idea that there exists an alternative to the European project that we hate. We as the New Right hate the European project that is being led by the EU, but there was a European project before that, and that is quite much ours. In In the 40s, there was a movement of people defending Europe against foreign influences, American, Soviet influences. And there's a continuity from this movement till today. So it's very important for people to understand that Mr. Steuckers is a living bridge in this sense. He knew the generation of people like Leon de Grelle, who came from his country and who fled to Spain, Mr. Thiriard, who he has known personally, and also other figures that are relevant to our New Right movement right now, including some very quite obscure ones like Horst Mahler, who is sitting in jail in Germany. So I would like to emphasize once again, there is a question of continuity and there is a question of necessity to build out our skills that have been lost, skills of command of many languages, and skills of investigating source material in original language. So one thing I would like to point out that's quite important in Mr. Steuckers' work the last years is his work on Carl Schmitt. His book has been reviewed by myself. I have also added some comments of myself. This is a very important thinker for our movement right now, giving alternatives to the liberal and anti-political project that is governing Europe. And young people should investigate this writer, Carl Schmitt. And a very good introduction has been given by Mr. Steuckers, and it's being translated into many languages right now.
And I think Carl Schmitt's one of he has been getting more attention recently. I've seen reviews of Carl Schmitt's work and his ideas on many YouTube channels lately. Of course, the difference between someone who is not an expert on the topic explaining prima facie what he reads in the book versus what an expert reads and compares it to and contrasts it to is quite different. So it's important generally to actually read academic work on these topics because you can't be guaranteed of the quality of what some YouTuber is telling you. And that applies to me just as much as anyone else.
Yes, another thing that I think is important for us to perhaps discuss a little bit is something about our, I would call it low countries situation. Our low countries have been regrettably divided into three sovereign states. But sitting here, we can tell young people, but also people of older age who have been miseducated in our new system, that there exists such a thing as the Low Countries as a cultural unit, also as a geopolitical unit. Mr. Steuckers and myself have been working on getting this message across, and to give to people to understand that this unity, which was understood by people like Huizinga, what Mr. Steuckers has been quoted, is a cultural sphere that can stand on its own merits. That is also a geopolitical sphere that has a lot of potential. This potential has been realized only in very small degree by the so-called Benelux, so the political economic union that was intended in 1944 and that's still officially alive. This unit, I would say, people should understand it on its own merits. We are a construct, conglomeration of regions, 17 estates, that in fact cover 4 or 5 languages, so Dutch, French, Luxembourgian, Frisian, and German, as far as it is spoken in the eastern regions of Belgium. And also multiple languages, religions, so Protestantism and Catholicism. In this sense, we resemble rather a state like Switzerland. Switzerland has a similar situation. It is also a Rechtsgebiet. It is an area that has been thrown together by history, left open as a sovereign state. And it would do us good as so-called Netherlands, so-called Belgium, and so-called Luxembourgians to reinvestigate the value of our Burgundian identity, because such a thing exists. And not to focus too much on differences between our north, our south, and our Luxembourgian southeast. The differences are being emphasized a lot, especially by hotheads in the nationalist movement. They are being emphasized to the degree that cooperation becomes impossible. And it is worthwhile looking at history and at our culture in a correct way, in a historically informed way.
Yeah, of course, we're all proponents of a greater Netherlands, I suppose, but funnily enough, I think we could use some of the EU propaganda against it, of European brotherhood and so on, to turn towards our purposes, including things like national reintegration of, this, how would you say, broken up countries like the Netherlands. I would like to go back to one thing you said about sort of the Anglosphere breaking our tradition, sort of the continuity of our tradition, where from a period, you could say from the 60s, 70s, maybe the 80s, but certainly from the 80s till the 2000s, 2010s, the Anglosphere culture has become so incredibly dominant that we've forgotten a lot of our own tradition. And a lot of the new nationalists coming into this movement are completely unfamiliar with their own national tradition, with their own intellectual schools, with their own philosophical ideas. And of course, we as Dutch don't have that many, but we have, for example, the Calvinist tradition. We've got some particular Catholic ideas from Belgium. But I think that's quite important to emphasize, is that still way too many people within this movement take their ideas from the Anglosphere. They listen to Anglosphere dissidents, but to be a nationalist, you have to be reacquainted with your own roots and your own ideas. And that's one of the reasons I want to bring Mr. Steuckers on, indeed, because he is a connection to that past. And hopefully he can pique the interest of listeners to go and investigate these ideas, even though he says he's heard them all 1,000 times.
Well, it's an interesting thing what you just said. You mentioned the term whole Netherlands. The Great Netherlands you mentioned, but there is such a thing as a whole Netherlands. There are two different movements. There is a Great Netherlands and there is a whole Netherlands movement. It's important to make that distinction, to give people to understand that the Greater Netherlands movement is a wholly different beast than the whole Netherlands movement. The whole Netherlands movement covers all of the former Burgundian Krijts, the northern part of it, and is more in favor of an integrationist view of our history. While the Greater Netherlands movement is in fact just a project to unite Flanders with the northern Netherlands. Maybe Mr. Steuckers can elaborate on that.
Yeah, of course, there is a difference that you have just defined. It's perfect, but I think in the terms of the Burgundischer Kreis, which was officially coined by Emperor Charles V in the 16th century, before the split between several confessions, mainly the Calvinist and the Catholic, but there were other forces. There were the Lutherans in the eastern of the present-day Netherlands. There were also the Confessio Belgica around humanists, etc., etc. It was quite complicated. The religion patterns of the 16th century were quite complicated, and they were, in fact, after a war of 80 years between the Calvinists, let's say, and the Catholics being considered as Spanish, but the main troops were not Spanish. There were very few Spanish troops. Most of the troops were recruited, even in present-day Netherlands, the so-called German troops of the Spanish army, the Tercios Alemanes, were mainly Dutch people, even later on. So there was also a shift of population. The Protestant from the south came to the Netherlands, but the Catholic from the Netherlands spread in the south, but also in northern Spain, which is often forgotten. But this civil war, I would say, which lasted 80 years, were then resumed by an alliance, a very funny alliance. I summarized very quickly here, but at the end of the 17th century, there is an alliance between the southern Netherlands, thus Spain, and the northern Netherlands against Louis XIV, which is often forgotten. And Louis XIV, he lost, in fact, the battle in history, and he was astonished because I told the people from the Flemish movement, and I tell it to the Dutch too, in the, let's say, in the myth of our own history, as well as in the south as in the north, you don't think about the 17th century. The 17th century is being forgotten. It's, of course, a very rich century for the north, but it's a sad, as in Germany, it's a terrible century for the south, where everything was destroyed, and Brussels was bombed down by the French in 1695. Liège was also destroyed by purely terrorist activities. They invented it, especially in the Pfalz, in German Palatinate, between the river Mosel and the Rhine. And in Alsace, everything was destroyed. We don't know the history of the 17th century. In the 17th century, all the ingredients of a reconstruction of the Burgundische Kreis are present. And I was astonished because I was looking for several books, and I discovered a book from a Walloon, which was, of course, in his former books, pro-French. He seemed to be pro-French, but his book on Louis XIV and the wars of the North, so the wars against the Netherlands, but also the very funny alliance and then enmity with Sweden, and the policy of France in Germany at that time. He has exactly the same point of view that we should have. At the end of his book, it's Hervé Asquin, professor at the Free University of Brussels. So it's quite very important to reread the history of our 17th century. And that's the first thing. Then when after Napoleon, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands was re-established, we must not forget, as you say, Professor Wolfheze, that it was the British who tried to destroy the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, because we united the coal mines of the Walloon part, the textile industry in Flanders, but also around Liège, the Dutch Navy, the colonies in the Far East, in the Pacific, so in Indonesia, etc. So, and then the possible attraction, and that was often forgotten, except from, I don't remember his name again, from the Noord-Duitse beweging, so the North German movement in Antwerp, who said, yeah, but a strong United Kingdom of the Netherlands could have attracted the region of Hanover, which was English at the time of Napoleon, but the English abandoned all implication in Germany at that time. But Hanover was attracted by Prussia, but had the United Kingdom of the Netherlands still existed, we could have attracted Hanover, because the difference of languages is not important in northern Germany. When I was one day in the Frankfurt book fair, a German man said, you speak Dutch, that's very easy, I have a present for you. And he gave me the German constitution written in the dialect of Mecklenburg-Pommern. And they don't say eine Verfassung for a constitution, but a verwachting.
Yeah.
Well, I think
what
you say is very important, because you are pointing out the term that is actually quite important in this regard, namely Duitsland. Yes, there is such a thing as the Lower Netherlands, which in fact also includes what you say, the northern part of what we would call West Germany. So we can also see that we still have cooperation between the Benelux and North Rhine-Westphalen, so that's the region across the border with Germany, which is was even reactivated in 2008. This economic forum and this social forum. So it means that even our globalist leaders, they understand there is some sense in regional cooperation. It's practical. And there is a cultural link, of course, as you say, which is very strong. This is something that Faust, in his way, in his channel, has been talking about. He has called his channel also Dietse Bazuin, to point out this lower Germanic entity of which we are part as the Benelux as well. So I think that's a very valid point that you made.
I would like to add something about the whole 1830 conflict. Is that the king at the time, William I, he had been at Waterloo. He had been a commander of the Dutch contingent at Waterloo. And what people often forget is that there were as many Dutch troops at Waterloo as there were British. In fact, the British were an absolute minority of the troops there. There were far more Germans than Dutch troops. And if you had the Prussians, it was 75% or so of the army there was Germanic. And he did not like Wellington. And Wellington, having a very important place in the British government afterwards, created a lot of animosity. It's not for nothing that the battlefield of Waterloo was completely plowed over by King William, and he put a giant monument on top of it as a slight to Wellington. And another thing was, the king was very much in favor of cooperation with the Germans. He wanted to re-establish the Holy Roman Empire and join it as the Burgundian Knights in exactly those terms. So the British saw that as a threat, and in 1830 they supported the French, who broke up the United Netherlands at the time. So that's quite an important part of why the Netherlands was broken up as well, because of personal animosity as well.
Yeah, I would add three things about that. It's if I talked about the possibility of a projection to Hanover, Lower Saxony in Germany, but there is also today a projection in the south. I've spent part of my youth, especially the summer holidays, were spent due to the professional activities of my father. They were spent in the Franche-Comté along the Swiss border. And when I was a child or a teenager, I didn't pay attention at that time. But I came back when I was over 50. When I was 50, so after almost 32 years. The first things I was astonished, I saw everywhere Flemish supermarkets, Colruyt. Said very funny here. It's far away from Flanders, and then the supermarket of the place there, everything was written in French and in Dutch, many products. So I said, why? And I had the answer when I came out of the supermarket. They were furnished by lorries, huge lorries of Colruyt. I said, but how is that possible? Then in September, I came back to my school, and my colleague for geography was a French lady, and she used French books. Then they say, yay, but the three provinces, Lorraine, Lothringen, Alsace, and Franche-Comté, are furnished in goods by Antwerp and Rotterdam, through the Rhine. So the idea of the Burgundische Kreis was not idiot. After 300 or 400 years of French annexation, they are still depending on the harbors of Antwerp and Rotterdam. So we have a projection to the south too. We have a projection to Scandinavia. to the Baltic area. So it's a part of Europe which has a projection everywhere. And we are, in our pragmatical ideas, we are able to conceive also further. If you see also, there is one important in our literature, there is one important thing, especially in Flanders nowadays. I don't know if it's the same in the northern Netherlands, but figures in our history were everywhere. For instance, in Latin America, there was, for instance, even in the 80 years war, in the 16th, 17th century, there was a guy from Bruges, I think, or from Antwerp. No, from Antwerp. He was in Venice. And in Venice, he organized trade with Eurasia on a Eurasian level, because Venice had offices in Crimea. He organizes also the trade from the Calvinists without taking into account the fact that it was banned by the King of Spain. So he was a subject of the King of Spain because he lived in Antwerp, but he organized the trade as well from the Catholics in Flanders as from the Calvinists from Amsterdam. Which is funny. They are the first Lord Mayor of London. The first Lord Mayor of London was a Flemish guy. He invented
there was a Flemish department even in London.
Yeah, for instance, there was a projection also. Also, the British Isles, you Dutch, especially the Northern Dutch, the Calvinists, determined the history of England in the 16th century.
Yeah, with Cromwell and with the Glorious Revolution. And
yeah, but not only Cromwell, but a lot of people being intellectuals or theologians or I don't know what, who organized England at that time. And that was not new. So that's the capacity of projection of the Low Countries in Europe in a positive way, is to say pragmatical and not militaristic.
Yes, I think this ties into the question of artificial borders. So we have nation states around us, the Great Germany, the Great France, and Great Britain, and they have imposed on the in-between lying countries their projected borders, right? So we are facing artificial borders all around us. For example, why is East Frisia, which is Frisian-speaking, not part of the Netherlands, right? Why is the southern part of the French Netherlands still cut off in part of France? These are just pure power politics. They have nothing to do with cultural identity. They have nothing to do with economic, social interest. They are purely power projections of neighboring countries that we are forced to cope with, and that even includes our own internal border. So the Belgian-Dutch border is highly artificial. It doesn't follow a religious line because the northern Netherlands officially has a part of the Southern Catholic Netherlands. It is even against, it's even a power politics that was projected by foreign powers. So the mouth of the Scheldt River and the port of Antwerp is cut off by this mouth of the Scheldt River, which is in the hands of the Dutch, which is a power projection. So it's not a correct border. The border is totally artificial. The same even applies to tiny Luxembourg, right? Luxembourg has been cut into two parts. When Belgium was established, right? There is now a province of Luxembourg in Belgium, as well as a Grand Duchy of Luxembourg that's independent.
Parts are Germans and parts are French.
Right.
And Wiedenhofen were Luxembourg, but they are French now.
Yeah. So when somebody like...
add one very important thing. Karim van Overmere, which is a Flemish politician, he's also an historian who wrote a book about the partition of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, and he quoted the fact that people were recruited in London in Paris and in prisons everywhere in France and in England, to organized militias who struggled, especially in Flanders, in Ghent and Bruges and in Antwerp. They fought for the so-called Belgian government, the first Belgian government. So they were recruited like they recruit in some parts where immigrants live now. They recruited people to fight in Syria. It is exactly the same pattern for Belgium. Otherwise, it had been impossible to get it. And I said, yeah, Karim van Overmeer exaggerated maybe for the sake of the Flemish movement. He organized that, and now the source is the very Belgicist or the very Belgian nationalist Pierre Nothomb, who wrote a very interesting history of these militias recruited in London and in Paris. And after that, this militia, once the Belgian government was in place, they said we have to get rid of that, but because they were simply bandits, and they sent them to Portugal to organize a constitutional revolution in order to get the leader there, the king of the queen, I don't remember, to get rid of her or of him, because he was not obeying British policy. So the same guys were sent to Portugal 2 years after, in 1832.
The manualist wars, those were. People don't know this, but between 1815 and 1821, the British actually occupied Portugal under a military government, and there was a popular revolt to overthrow them and throw them out. They wouldn't even let the King of Portugal back into his own country because they were basically colonizing Portugal at the time.
Well, I think this is a good thing to point out, that there is foreign interference in the drawing of the borders of the Netherlands as a whole, and internally between Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. And we should not forget that part of our elites, then as now, is collaborating with this globalist interference. So there is a certain section of the northern Netherlands populace, a tiny section, the patricians, the business people, banksters, we could call them, who are interested in maintaining a power hold that would be diluted if Belgium would have been included in a greater state. So it is in their interest to maintain a kind of a pirate republic in the north, as they did in the 17th century. And I think that this group, in fact, is still calling the shots, these patricians and their bankster liaisons. Internationally, they are interested in keeping us small and divided.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've gone long enough on this topic. I think we've covered a lot of things. To finish this off, I wanted to ask you, Mr. Steuckers, what do you think the future holds for Europe and America?
Yeah, the future. I'm not a crystal ball. It's very difficult, but we are, and I'm quite pessimistic at that time, because I don't see any reaction to all the plans the globalists are coining to crush us and to divide and to precipitate the decline of Europe. I don't see any reactions. There was the reaction of the yellow vests in France. It was interesting, let's say, two years ago. It started 2 years ago, but it's finished now. And the lockdown, they accepted, the people, they accept all that, and they are accepting all the regulations that are destroying the civil liberties. Never, even in the worst totalitarian regimes, you were prevented to have a coffee on a terrace. I've never seen that in my life. I'm not the guy who is going to go to drink beer the whole day round in a pub. But if I go to buy books, of course, because that's my main hobby, to buy books in the town, I like to have a look on my books on a terrace drinking a coffee. That's now forbidden. We are compelled now. It's very interesting. Technically, it's perfect. We can have from several parts of the Netherlands. We can have a common meeting now by computer. That's very nice, but I would like to meet the people here around in a restaurant or or even at home. We can organize a barbecue or something like that. It's become impossible. Everything is being destroyed. Don't forget, school has been destroyed by the measures taken by the governments everywhere in Europe. School has been destroyed, so that's a part of our future which is totally destroyed. The children, the youngster that have been scholarized, that has been sent to school in the last 2 years, are they going to find a job? Because if I'm a boss and I said, but you have studied in 2021, 21, 22, so you have not been totally trained for the job you're asking for. That's terrible. And they know it. The young people, they know it. They are not socialized. No, you have already problems with isolation, drugs, etc., where people have totally irrational criminal attitudes. But now they are not socialized. Of course, they fight sometimes during the playtime at school, but that's from parts of the socialization of the young people. Impossible. Work has been destroyed. So the community within a company, within an enterprise, there was a community of workers. This community is destroyed. When I had to phone to the ministry to solve the problem for my pension. When some weeks before retiring, I had to ask questions at several. All they say, we cannot answer your question simply because we are not in office. I'm at home. I'm fed up being at home. All the officials told me that. So everything has been destroyed. The links in the family, which is perhaps the most vicious and dangerous effect of the lockdown now, is the family links have been destroyed. Many grandchildren, they cannot see their grandparents anymore, and that's very, because the link between the generation, I would say the transmission of I don't know, an intellectual knowledge, but the things a grandmother teach to her grandchildren, the simple sentence she pronounces that you will remember all your life long. They are destroying family, work, school. Everything has been destroyed. So it will give us a lot of problems in the next years to come. And I'm retired now, and I will not have an happy retirement. That I'm sure of it. So then second, which is the geopolitical perspective of Europe. Yeah. Nowadays, there is no perspective. They are talking about the gender, about I don't know what racism that doesn't exist, etc. They talk to you about all that, and they don't solve the problem. You know, look, in Germany, in the last issue of Junge Freiheit, there was just a guy, Lebanese, he made films in he has made a lot of films in Germany. He said, but I came to Europe expecting civilization, expecting all possibilities, the country, the continent of the 100,000 perspectives, and now I'm only declining. He made personally with his own money, he made a video. His name is Himmat Karim Himmat. I don't know which is the first name and the second one. That's many people from the immigration are complaining. They say you are the only white left that we know. Me. Simply because I had a historical perspective, and they understand that we have to have that in order to be a big man.
Turks, for example, say we are weak. Like I know some people.
We are weak, but now the most danger, the biggest danger is, what is going to happen to Germany when Mrs. Baerbock becomes the Chancellor. You have, and as you said, Dr. Wolfheze, you had a plan at the end of the Second World War to transform Germany in an agrarian country. But now, if Baerbock is going to eliminate all sources of energy, are going to eliminate the German-Russian cooperation for gas, what will become of Germany, the very center of Europe?
Well, I'm not so pessimistic as you are. I think that all the measures you are talking about, all the problems that you are mentioning, are actually a sign for us that Europe is a quite strong and dangerous entity for the globalists. It is a measure of how strong we are to see how much problems they are piling up. You have yourself described it as pyropolitics, so the burning down of non-globalist centers around the world by the globalists, carried by the Anglo-Saxon Empire, of course. And I think this COVID measures can be understood as a burning down politics, a destruction politics that's being unleashed, aimed mainly at Europe, at our culture, at our cultural transmission, at our value system, at our sciences, at our education. It is a kind of a weapon of last resort, like a nuclear option that the globalists are using against us. But I think it shows how desperate the globalists are, in fact. Because if they have to resort to this kind of weapon, what does that mean about us? How strong we are and how dangerous we are in potential.
Yeah, but that was written in Robert Steuckers, an Austrian who immigrated to the United States and became a counselor of the several American presidents in the foreign ministry, who became an ambassador, etc., etc. And he wrote that indeed the main trump cards of Europe were education and racial homogeneity. So they had to destroy that, because this is the main trump cards of Europe, of course.
I was saying to Mr. Steuckers that I think these measures which are being inflicted upon Europe, right, the mass immigration project, the umvolking, and these COVID measures, they are in fact a compliment. They are showing how afraid the globalists are of Europe as a power structure.
Yeah, but the people in the United States are undergoing the same. Policies, except that till now, I think 18 states have refused many of the measures.
Yes, Florida and Texas and a few others. But I don't think that this is true. Maybe they think we are a danger, but they also, the reason they're implementing these things is not because they know they can get away with it. They know we won't fight back, and they're just busy breaking our backs. And what are we able to do against it? Not very much, or anything at all, really.
You have to be stoned and to remain what you are. Because, I had sometimes problems because they say you are this and that, and you are plotting, you're a complotist, and you're new right, etc., etc. My answer when they started was irony, or simply to be like, he's not very well known outside France. He was Gondinet, the founder of the Pardes publishing house in Paris, which is an important one in the new right system, or simply the right, conservative little word in the French-speaking part of Europe. He said, "Nous sommes des convives de pierre," like in a theater of Molière. It's the guy. We are like a statue among the people on the at the table. So the only answer when they were trying, when I was brainwashed, or when they tried to brainwash me, my answer was simply like that, an ironical. Simply doing that to say, yeah, you can talk a lot, I don't listen to you.
To be stoic about these things.
Yeah, to be stoic, to be completely, my father was illiterate, the poor man, but he had character, which is much more important. And he say a man has never to capitulate his ideas in front of anything else. So if they try to say, yeah, but you are it and that, you do that. An ironical, and then they feel they are ridiculous. And don't try to give argument. They don't listen to you too. So it's better to do like that.
I think our enemies, they don't have arguments. That is also why we are not allowed to debate them. That's very simple.
No, but simply, it's simply unrealistic projects they have. It's typical for the gender mentality or the cancel culture. It's a simple will to destroy and not to use the material you have inherited from history and to use them. That's what we are trying to do. We've talked about the Netherlands and the past history of the Netherlands. We try to use the material to reconstruct and to have a positive at the end, a positive country or a positive entity within Europe, using cultural elements, using political elements, economical elements to construct, to be positive. They don't harm. They don't harm.
They can only destroy things. They can only criticize. They can never build anything positive.
Yeah, because they say reality is bad.
Well, they are in a sense they're agnostics. Right? In a sense, they're agnostics. They refuse nature. They refuse how things are. They refuse the reality that men and women are different. They refuse the reality that there is inequality, that there is hierarchy. And to say that is essentially opposing yourself to nature, which is a sort of Gnostic idea to say that God is evil.
Yeah, but that's why the Chinese are laughing at us.
Yes.
They use a name, complicated name to design the typically Western intellectual teaching the whole world or how the whole world should function. I don't remember the name. It's a Chinese name. No, it's a Chinese name it's the Chinese name to call the Western intellectuals.
Baizo, they call the leftists.
Yeah, Baizo. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, but
me neither. But yes, idiots is essentially what it means. Yes,
yeah.
naive. Yeah. Well, I think we should more or less end it there.
Yeah.
Maybe, what do you think? Does Europe have a better perspective in the future, or America?
Difficult to say. America has not the homogeneity it had. The problem is racial, and they know it. Everyone knows it from one perspective or another, doesn't matter. So America is not the America of the 50s anymore, that's sure. But Europe, you have Eastern and Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, the situation is not so bad, but you know the risk, and the risk is evident since a couple of weeks, where the French generals have written 2 letters to the presidents to say, yeah, the situation cannot last any longer, simply because we risk a terrible civil war. Mm-hmm. So it's not a group belonging to the new right or the conservative forces that are writing these letters, but the very French generals having no ideological bias. So this letter is quite important.
Yeah,
we risk in Western Europe.
They have no ideological bias, but
we risk disorders and strongly disorders, and I don't know how we're going to solve them now. With the or you should have everywhere in Europe for the next election a completely shift in the political, but I don't see the people ready to vote for alternative forces, or not, or at least not for a sufficient amount of votes that are making mass, like Canetti said, the philosopher Canetti. He said you have to make mass, so to have a sufficient amount of people to promote your projects.
I think the most important thing is to get rid of the traumas. I call them psycho-historical traumas that Europe has suffered as the result of losing collectively the Second World War and the follow-up conflicts, the decolonization projects. I think if these traumas are removed, Europe will bounce back. That is my opinion. It is, in my opinion, very important that a metapolitical battle is waged, and that the psycho traumas are removed from our collective conscience. Because if a nation considers itself a loser and has been on the losing end ever since, and it incorporates this kind of experience as through feminism, as through oikophobia, as through all kinds of psychosomatic trouble that our nations face. Till that occurs, we cannot hope for a geopolitical solution, any political solution for that matter.
Yes, the battle is cultural. I agree. Yes. Yeah. All right. I think we shall end it there then. Thank you very much.
And we meet, perhaps, thank you for all both of you, and I hope we will meet again for other
events, yes.
Other projects, topics.